What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. IBF and now WBC Welterweight champ Errol Spence Jr. 26-0 versus former two-division champ Danny Garcia 36-2. Boy, this fight is being slept on. Now, there's been a ton of action since boxing's return, but this is my matchup of the year, given the quality and depth of the welterweight division. Let's get into Spence versus Garcia. Now, the days and weeks following the undefeated champion Errol Spence's devastating car accident following his close title unification win versus Shawn Porter, a car accident that Spence is actually very lucky to be alive from, I thought of a few things. One, you cannot overstate how fortunate that man is to be alive, given the speed that car was going and him being ejected from the car, having not worn a seatbelt, which some believe, ironically, assisted his survival in this case. I also thought that the severity of the injuries might have been totally understated and that there'd be serious questions on whether he could even resume a professional boxing career. It's just hard to believe that something that impactful takes place where the victim is then able to find himself back in the ring at all, let alone within a year of the accident. That's incredible. And I was thinking, best case scenario, let's say he is able to get back into working out, then training hard, then sparring, and so forth. I didn't think we'd see Spence back in the 147-pound welterweight division. He was a pretty huge welterweight to begin with. Amazing talent, tremendous physical strength and power, and as evidenced by the performance against Lamont Peterson and Mikey Garcia, also an increasingly excellent technical boxer. Remember, once upon a time, Spence was the guy who, it was almost an urban legend, like caught and hurt Floyd during sparring or knocked Floyd Mayweather down during sparring. So he'd kind of already developed a reputation and his name started buzzing by the time we were even seeing him on HBO and so forth. Errol Spence Jr. is a patient and skilled hunter. He could cut the ring off wonderfully and obliterate opponents, especially as he traps them against the ropes. And it turns out, can totally flip the script strategy-wise and box defensively, dominating rounds behind a jab and good movement. But how in the hell, having been out of action for the longest period of his career and now 30 years old, train in a way where he could safely and efficiently get back down to 147? In recent years, Spence looked a lot bigger between fights than he used to back when he was destroying quality fighters like Chris Algieri and Leonard Bundu while on the come-up. So I thought then that it was only a matter of time before Spence would head to 154, even before the accident. So, after the accident, I thought that whenever Spence did return to the ring, which I didn't expect to be soon, it would almost certainly have to be at 154 because his pro boxing lifestyle and routine had been disrupted by the accident and recovery. But here we are, already approaching his return to the ring, and his welcome back fight is versus two-division champ Danny Garcia, whose only two losses were in nearly even fights versus Shawn Porter and versus a prime Keith Thurman. Danny Garcia might be the most accurate knockout puncher in the division. Sharp boxer, tough spirit, he's never been stopped. This is one hell of an ambitious return for Spence, given the questions about where he is performance-wise. Physically, psychologically, he's still barely removed from possibly the most traumatic experience of his life. I mean, if this isn't, I hate to know what is. And the thing about this welterweight division is that these fights that determine the pecking order with the belts and public opinion are all decided by 1 to 2 rounds. Look at all of the recent division-defining fights besides Errol Spence and Kell Brook. You've got Thurman versus Porter, razor close. Thurman versus Danny Garcia, razor close. Same with Porter Garcia, Spence versus Porter, even Thurman versus Pacquiao. All of these fights are either split decisions or fights with 115 to 113 scorecards. And yet, people kind of view this 147 pool as having some clear hierarchy. Spence and Crawford are at the top here, and everyone else, Shawn Porter, Danny Garcia, post-injuries Keith Thurman, at least a level below that. And Pacquiao, people will differ on where they put him on there. But ask yourself this, are these tiers a little bit of an illusion, especially when they're taken as absolutes by the fight fans? I mean, I'm looking at these Errol Spence versus Danny Garcia betting odds, and I see Garcia's going off at an almost 3-1 underdog. And I'm wondering, where's the fights that I've seen Danny Garcia get the brakes beat off him? I've never seen him lose by any noticeable margin. Again, Thurman might have beaten him by 2 rounds, 8-4. I think I had it 7-5. But to assume that Spence, in his first fight back, is going to beat a guy who's about as good as it gets in the division, these variables and unknowns are just too big not to be taken seriously. The accident, the physical injury, the mental trauma, the weight gain, the layoff, and inactivity. Keep in mind, these professional athletes are systemic about keeping their tools sharp. This many hours of training per week, this much running per week, this amount of sparring per month. And when you have sometimes even a slight disruption of that system, there's no guarantee that the train gets back on the track and responds as it did before all these other things happened. If there was no car accident and period of total inactivity, except for physical therapy, if these things didn't happen, I'd see this as a close fight. A close fight that I'd favor Spence in. Now, Danny Garcia first started making his name at 140. And his biggest win there was a knockout of then pound-for-pound star Amir Khan, who was on a roll at the time, beating Kotelnik, Paulie Malignaggi, Marcos Maidana. He stopped Zab Judah with a body shot in the 5th round after dominating him for 4 rounds. Amir Khan was on fire. He did have a controversial decision loss versus Lamont Peterson in Peterson's hometown of D.C., then was reinstated as champ when Peterson failed the drug test. Point being, when Danny Garcia shockingly knocked out Amir Khan in 2012, Garcia went from an up-and-comer that you need to keep an eye on to the man at 140, where he would then beat an old Eric Morales for a second time, this one via knockout, and then he beat Zab Judah and had a big unification showdown against the other man at 140, Lucas Matisse. This was a major fight and took place on the Floyd Mayweather versus Canelo Alvarez undercard. Matisse was looking very scary at the time, having just knocked out Lamont Peterson in the 3rd round. Well, Garcia won that hard-fought battle. Then he won one more fight via decision versus Mauricio Herrera in a fight that I thought that Garcia should have lost. I thought Garcia got outboxed and busted up a little. Well, Garcia earned the decision win, retains his 140 titles, and then moves up to 147 and gets acclimated in a tough, razor-thin fight versus Lamont Peterson, just after knocking Rod Salka clean out. So Garcia, by 2015, is growing into the 147 division, but it's also looking like his punching power at 140 isn't quite as devastating at 147, which could be an issue going forward for a precision puncher like Danny. But then, after knockout wins versus Malignaggi, Brandon Rios, Adrian Granados, guys that aren't easy to stop, it's clear that Danny still has a lot of pop at welterweight. And again, his only 2 losses were razor close to Keith Thurman and Shawn Porter, 2 of the division's elite. Hell, Thurman at the time was looking like the king of the hill in that division. He took Garcia's WC belt and retained his WBA belt. So now, with the shot at redemption, Danny Garcia is facing Errol Spence, who you might truly view as being a notch above Porter and Thurman. But again, can you really count on Spence being at 90-95% of his pre-accident self and being sharp enough to earn a win versus someone who is right there, basically 1 or 2 rounds on a judge's scorecard away from being the division's best? Sure, at his best, Spence is beating Kell Brook for the IBF title and running through quality opponents like Chris Algieri, Leonard Bundu, Lamont Peterson. I just think that it would have been wise to take 1, maybe 2 tune-up fights like Tyson Fury did when he returned to the ring after his long layoff. I know Fury was out of action much longer than Spence was and gained a bunch of weight, but he also wasn't hospitalized after being launched from his totaled convertible at a very high speed. This is a dangerous fight. I mean, all fights are dangerous, but this is a dangerous fight. Garcia's just not the opponent that you want to be shaking the ring rust off against. If Spence beat Garcia without the accident, it would be a top 3 win for him. But with the accident, returning immediately to beat Garcia would probably be his most impressive accomplishment. Very tall task here, and Garcia's got to be ultra motivated, having come so close twice just to come up short. Danny knows what this would mean for his legacy. It would vindicate those close decision losses and would instantly establish him at the top of the welterweight heap. How do I expect this to play out? Well, which Errol Spence Jr. do you think we're likely to get? Is Spence's plan A to come forward and hunt like he did versus Peterson and Brook, even though he took some heavy fire in the first half versus Brook? Or will Spence redeploy his back foot box behind a jab approach that he did versus Mikey Garcia, when Garcia jumped up to challenge Spence after fighting Robert Easter 2 divisions below at 135? That was an odd matchup, and Mikey was one of boxing's elites, pound for pound, but Spence pitched a perfect game, executed a game plan that most didn't even know he had in him. That style of fight. You know, they were trotting out the possibility of a Danny Garcia versus Mikey Garcia fight. I would have favored Danny. He's much more established at welterweight and is naturally the bigger guy. Where you can argue Danny was at his best at 140, Mikey's best weight class was somewhere between featherweight 126 and lightweight 135. I think that Mikey is seeking super fights and big paydays at 147, perhaps a Pacquiao fight down the line. But functionally, Mikey still appears in over his head at 147. Nonetheless, Spence's game plan and execution versus Mikey Garcia was remarkable, but is that what we're going to get with him versus Danny? Both Danny and Mikey are precise sharpshooters with good power. I think Danny's got more power than Mikey. Danny's also a little taller than Mikey. But I have seen Danny outboxed a couple of times. Sure, the Herrera fight was 6 years ago, but that style did give Danny some problems. But I just go back to questioning whether Spence can execute on a game plan that requires timing, precision, lots of stamina, with these X factors still lingering. A part of me wants to pick Errol Spence because he is the undefeated champion who has now beaten Brook, Porter, Mikey Garcia, Lamont Peterson, and picking Spence, probably by close decision, would be the logical pick that would make most fight fans say, well, yeah, that sounds like the most likely outcome and fits perfectly with the way that this welterweight division is working. But something as disruptive as the accident, injuries, inactivity, altering a program that requires such a delicate balance of different elements coming together to build and maintain a fighter as high functioning as Errol Spence is enough of a reason for me to slightly go the other way and pick Danny Garcia. I've read and heard reports that Errol Spence Jr. is training as hard as ever, is not struggling with weight, and is already back to sparring, and that's all great news. Again, it's a blessing that the man is still alive, and to be fair, he was having some issues with discipline, training, and his out-of-the-ring lifestyle before the accident. It sounds like a lot of that is cleaned up and that Spence is recommitted to the sport in full. I just think that it would take 1 to 2 fights to get back to where he was, and Danny Garcia isn't the partner you want to be taking the training wheels off against. Picking Spence under these conditions would actually be a disservice to what Garcia has shown us over the years. Again, both fighters at their best is a close call. Favor Spence. Shake that thing up and launch one fighter out of a speeding vehicle, keep him out of work for several months. I think that Spence might struggle to win rounds, and I wouldn't be surprised if he gets caught and perhaps dropped at some point of the fight, but gets back to work and makes this fight close, losing a contested decision to the new WBC and IBF welterweight champ, Danny Garcia. I actually can't believe that I'm picking against Spence here, but him winning would really be a near miracle. And if that does happen, that accomplishment should not be taken lightly, given all that has happened. But let me know your thoughts. A loss would not mean that it's over for Spence, although it would sour the potential super fight between him and Terrence Crawford. And I do, once again, wonder how long someone as big as Spence will continue to fight at 147. But as it pertains to this fight, I think Spence just needs a little more time to get all of the things back that made him a pound-for-pound elite fighter. And Danny Garcia's got to be foaming at the mouth for this opportunity at seizing glory. Please leave your comments in the comments, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.